Okay, ladies, so you've cut all of your strips for your piping, and we're now going to join the strips. So take 2 of your strips, put the others out of the way. It's easier to just work with 2. And you need your strips right sides together. Now, because my fabric is the same colour on the back as it's on the front, the easiest way to find out which is the wrong side is it's the side with the seam on it. So I'd opened and pressed that seam. So that's the wrong side. So I actually need it right sides together. So I'm going to turn that over, a bit of thread. And I've got my second strip. Again, that's the wrong side. So that makes it right sides together. And what I'm going to do is I take the 2 top edges where they're angled, and I'm just going to lay them one on top of each other. However, they will be slightly overlapping. Let me just... Can you see that? They overlap slightly, so I'm going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it's actually quite difficult to show you because this is not interfaced, so it doesn't sort of stand up. But the line between that sort of V there and the same V on the other side is where we're actually going to stitch. So what's quite easy to do, if I could find my chalk marker, which I don't appear to have here, is actually draw a line across there so that you know exactly where you're stitching. You need those 2 straight edges to be sitting together and the little corners poking out, and you're going to stitch between the V that you've made and the V on the other side to join those 2 pieces together. I use quite a short stitch length for this because I don't want it to come apart. So if it makes it easier, just mark it with a chalk marker so that you know exactly where you're stitching. I usually do just 1 back stitch because I don't want it to come unravelled. And I'm using thread in the top and the bottom that matches my piping. I'm going to get rid of any stray threads, and that's my first join. Now I usually wait until I finish doing all the joins before I then press all those seams open, so that's what I'm going to do now. So I then go to the other end and I'll take another piece of my strip that I've made and I'll put it right sides together. So I know that this is the right side because it's got none of the seams showing, none of the raw edges showing, and this is the right side because it's got them. So the wrong side, so I know it's got them, so I know that it's now right sides together. And I'm just going to do exactly the same thing again, and you continue to do that, adding strip by strip your piping strips that you've already made. Now it can get a little bit confusing. It's easier if your fabric looks different on the back than it does on the front. When it's exactly the same on the back as it is on the front, I have been known to make grave errors and get the wrong side up. And when you suddenly look at it and you think, oh, I've got a seam showing on the front, and you feel really silly, but hey ho. So that's the next piece on. So this is right side up. And what you're going to end up with is a really, really long strip of fabric. And I'm going to join the next one together. And I don't pin them or clip them, I just literally position them together. I'm just going to get rid of my threads because I hate all these extra threads. And let me see if you can see this now. You can see how it's sewn. It's sewn between these 2 little V marks where the fabric, this is a little piece from the piece that's on the bottom, and this is a little piece from the piece that's on the top. So it kind of is offset, but the 2 straight edges are together, and you end up with a nice angled join. we will be opening up all of those seams in a little while, but we need to join them all together first, and I will show you how to do that. I've only got a couple more to put on, so right sides together, slightly offset. The more you offset them, the bigger your seam allowance will be. I mean, mine is 1/4 of an inch because I literally offset them by, it's about 3/8 of an inch either side, but I've actually got far too big a needle in here for this. I should have changed down to a smaller one, but didn't. Oh, got 2 more to go, so right side up, right side. And again, I'm just joining them together. It's just the same process for each one. Once you've done it a few times, you'll find it's really easy to do. Initially, the first time you do it, you think, oh, I can't get this. It's really confusing. If you find it's difficult to show you on a video, actually, you may actually just find it easier with the photos in the pattern. But this is basically how you make piping, and you can use this piping method in any bag. And if the bag doesn't actually have piping on it, you can still use piping. You can use piping on just about any bag. However, there are some things that you will need to take into account. If you're adding piping to a flap, for example, I mean, this bag has been designed with piping, so the flap is exactly the right size to have piping on it. If you were to be adding piping to, let me think of an NCW, classic one that is, because the flap of an NCW, once it's sewn, if you've used the appropriate seam allowance, should be 8 inches wide. The main body of an NCW is 8 inches wide, so the flap sits perfectly on the body of the purse. If you add piping is going to sit on the outside of your flap, so you're basically going to be adding, if you're using 3mm piping cord, you're going to be adding 6mm to the width of the flap, so 3mm on either side. You'll also add 3mm to the length of the flap, and because your flap, particularly on an NCW, needs to be 8 inches wide, it's now 8 inches plus an extra 6mm, which is just over 1/4 of an inch. So it's now 8 1/4 inches wide, which means that your flap is too big for your purse. So if you're going to use piping on a pattern that hasn't got piping on it, your best bet is to reduce the width of the flap that you're making by the appropriate amount according to the size of your piping. So I've now joined all my pieces together, and I've got my ironing pad out. I'm going to go to my first join that hasn't been opened up. I'm just going to open it up with my fingers. Press it open. Try not to stretch this, because this will be stretchy, because it's did I do with my snips? I don't know what I did with my snips. I had them a second ago. There they are. And I'm just going to snip off those little extra pieces of fabric that overlap a little bit. You're just going to keep going along, and it'll be every other seam that you need to open, because your original seams are already been opened. So just going to keep going along. Try not to stretch it though, because this will stretch, and you don't want it stretched at this point. Going along, opening up the seams, trimming off those little extra pieces that are on either side. Don't save them, you don't need those. Keep going. This is quite, it seems quite tedious and laborious when you're doing it, but it gives you the opportunity to use perfect piping that matches your bag or the colour that you want specifically. If you wanted to use ready-made piping, you could do, but I think learning how to make your own is a really good skill to have. And for the competition, because the piping is an essential part of this bag, if you want to enter the competition part of this sew along, I'm going to ask you to post, along with your finished bag, a picture of your piping when it's cut into strips, so that I can see that you've actually made your own piping rather than using pre-made. It's fine if you want to use pre-made, and but there will be a point deducted for anybody that makes uses pre-made and doesn't use their own, because that's what this is about. This is about learning how to sew and make and sew your own piping. So keep going, keep going, keep going to the end. Now you will have more piping tape here, more of this tape than you actually need. It's difficult to estimate exactly how big a square to start with, because it really will depend how tightly you pull your piping, how well you stitch it, what seam allowances you use. So there's a variability to it that means it's easier just to have too much than it is to have too little. So my piping tape is now all joined together. All my seams are pressed open, so you can see they're pressed open, and the extra bits that were on the sides have now been trimmed off. So I just have one very long strip that is 1.25 inches wide. So now I need my, you can either use a zipper foot, you can use a piping foot. I am going to change this needle though, because that is just way too big for this. Let me see what I've got. I think I've got a 16 in there, and that's just too big for this fabric. So let me open my pot of magic tricks. What have I got there? That's an 18, those are 16s. Those are quilting needles. Jeans needle. Oh golly, so many needles. Okay. Let's just find my little screwdriver. There's nothing wrong with that needle, so I'm going to pop it back up there, because this is where you watch me make a complete pig's ear of it. Fluff on there, that's okay. Right, now I have This is a cording foot that I put on. It's a Teflon one because I don't have a metal one. I prefer this to my zipper foot. Now I need to find the end of my tape. And I'm going to move my tape just over there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my piping cord centrally on the wrong side, so the side that's got all of those joins and the seams that you can see, and then I'm going to fold it in half. Now if you really want to, you can clip all the way along the edge. You need to make sure that the two raw edges meet up, so if you want to clip it, then please do. I find clips a blessed nuisance, so I don't clip it. I just do it in small bursts and make sure that those two seams are joined together, the two raw edges, and I use, get myself all in a fuddle here, and I use my stiletto to help me. And I don't mean my swanky high heel shoe, I mean my stiletto. So let me just see if I can move this along a little bit for you. It might actually help if I have a bit of light on the subject, possibly. Not sure. So the two raw edges of my piping strip are together, and I'm going to just increase my stitch length a little bit to 3, and I'm going to start stitching. She says, what have I got down there? I've got my piping cord in the way of my presser foot. That's not helpful. I don't know why that's not wanting to move. Let's... Oh, I see. I've got it not quite in the right place. So let's try that again, shall we? So I find it's easier to just do a little bit, then fold it round, and just kind of hold it in place with my stiletto. If you've got a piping foot, you can use a piping foot. A zipper foot's good. Any of the above. Try not to stretch the piping fabric as you go, because you don't really want to do that. And again, I've got the same thread top and bottom, because sometimes if you're not very accurate, the stitching on the piping can show. It shouldn't do, but it sometimes does. So being able to have it in a matching colour to the actual fabric that you're using. Golly, that's a noisy motorbike outside. And you're stitching as close as you can to the actual piping cord. So you're making a sort of a sandwich, and your piping cord, it's just, you can see the piping cord is kept nicely at the top there. So I'm going to keep going, folding, stitching. Bit of thread there that I don't need. I need to be careful wearing, tend to wear scarves all through the winter. I need to be careful wearing scarves when I'm doing piping, because when I was doing the red piping for the original bag, I actually managed to not even realise I was in such a zone. My scarf got caught up and I just sewn my scarf into it. And since this is a nice new one that I got given for Christmas, I don't really want to end up with it as part of a handbag. I'm not pulling it through from the back, but it just helps me keep it straight when I hold onto the back of it as well. Now, if you're not using 3mm piping cord, you may need to amend the width of your piping tape. This has been calculated so that the gap, the seam allowance that you have on this side is 3/8 of an inch. Now I've got some dodgy stitching going on there. I don't know why. So let's just, I'm going to go back to the beginning there and do that bit again. I don't know why that's come out all bobbly, but I will. If you're a quilter, or if you're making binding to go inside of a bag, and there are still bag patterns out there which have binding inside, rather than having all the seams fully enclosed. And in some bags it actually, I used to say I wouldn't do a bag that had binding inside. However, in the last year's Bag of the Month club, Annie Urain from By Annie did a backpack which was lovely. I loved it. It was a really cool little design, and it was all bound inside. So I had to bite the bullet and do it. But actually, once you get your head around how to make binding or cut bias strips like this, it's not difficult. So you can use this method of cutting your binding strip, your piping strip, for cutting binding for a quilt, or for cutting binding to go inside of a bag. I'm still not a massive fan of binding inside of bags, but there are bags that it just helps with the structure. And actually having, I think it was binding on the Emmeline one as well last year, from the last season. Not the Flora, the one the season before. I can't remember what it was called now though. So your binding might be, you might have to cut wider strips than this, but the method remains the same. Those of you that are quilters will probably have done this before anyway, so it won't be new to you. Or you'll have cut the strips, but you may not have made piping. I don't know. Who knows? Now, if I'm making faux leather piping, I don't cut it on the bias because faux leather doesn't have a grain as such. I do, however, if I'm using, I tend to use quite soft faux leather, and most of my soft faux leathers are more stretchy one way than they are the other. So if you pull them across the width of the fabric, they're often more stretchy than they are along the length. So I cut my strips across the width of the fabric, and I basically usually cut width fabric, which is generally 150. So I might join two of them together, and I'll mitre the join and open the seams the same as I have with the fabric. However, I would actually just do a little line of top stitching to hold those seams open if I was using faux leather on both sides. And again, I'd only use a 1/4 inch seam allowance because you don't want to be adding too much bulk. And you'll be already adding bulk by using faux leather. So faux leather piping doesn't have to be cut on the bias because faux leather doesn't have a grain as such, and it will, because it's made of PU, it will bend around the corners quite nicely, bend around the curves quite nicely. Now, if you were doing piping on a bag that didn't have any curves, you could do piping without cutting it on the bias if you wanted to. It just looks nicer done on the bias. Anybody that did the Amiga pattern, that had a small amount of piping, and that wasn't cut on the bias because it was just a straight line. It was only a very small amount, just a small accent really. So I'd like to say we're coming up to the end. We are getting nearer to the end of our piping. And we're just going to make one long strip, and we're going to cut off what we need as we go. This is something you can use if you make cushions. You could use piping. Generally speaking, I would use a much bigger piping cord for a cushion because I think it looks quite nice with a big chunky piping cord around it. But yeah, this is basically piping, and you can use it on anything, clothing even, if you wanted to add piping to the top of pockets on a coat, or cuffs around the edge of cuffs if you're a dressmaker, or anything like that really. Not nearly as difficult as you expect it to be, is it, ladies? Now, if you wanted to make your own bias tape, bias binding, you would also cut. You can use this method to cut your fabric for bias binding. You'd obviously have to do it at the measurement that you need it to be, and then you press both raw edges into the centre, and you've created bias binding. So this is a very useful skill to learn because it can be used in so many different sewing disciplines. And I'm almost at the end. You'll be glad to know. It's quite long and laborious, but when I get to the other end, I just do a couple of back stitches take my thread out, and then I will cut, but I'm not going to cut right at the end there. I'm going to cut a little way further along. And that's probably not the best pair of scissors to be using for that. Let's find something more appropriate. That's it. I'm going to put my piping out of the way. Go back to the end. And what I do is I just smooth it out to make sure there's no little puckers in it, and sometimes you get a little bit of gathering, which is why I didn't cut the piping cord right at the end, because sometimes you just, the fabric kind of gathers up over the cord. Depends what fabric you're using. Sometimes it does it more than others. You can see, look, we've got a little bit of gathering there. It's only a little bit, but it just, you just need to kind of pull it out over the cord. You want your piping to sit nice and flat. You don't want it to be kind of frilly. No frilly piping here. There we go. So now I have just over 3 meters of piping. So I'm just going to get rid of all of these horrible thread bits that I've got, which will drive me insane. And then I'll just wind it up so that it's kept nice and tidy. And I just generally do it around my hand. Or even around a piece of card. If I'm making it to keep, and I do sometimes think, oh, I'll just make some piping, just feel in the mood to make piping, and I'll just make up a load of, in the colours that I use a lot of, and have them sort of sat in my drawer, as you would with ready-made piping. So I just literally wind it around a piece of cardboard to keep it nice and smooth. There we have it, piping all made. So I'm going to come back to you shortly and we'll look at how we put the piping on our flap.